What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Before we get into anything, if you do not already, subscribe to Believe in Nets on wherever you get your podcasts. Go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff. Really appreciate the engagement. But on today's episode, just had Collin, Helwig, and Anthony Puccio from NetsDaily and the Brooklyn Pod on to recap some of what we've seen from the Nets in these past few weeks, playing above expectations. But before that, need to touch on what we saw last night from the Brooklyn Nets getting their most improbable win of the season. And there have been several improbable ones, but they come in on the back end of a back-to-back. They beat the Sacramento Kings on Sunday while shorthanded, missing Dorian Finney-Smith and Dennis Schroeder and some other guys. And they come back last night missing pretty much half of their rotation. They're missing Nick Claxton, Dorian Finney-Smith, Ben Simmons, one other person who I'm blanking out right now. And then during the game, they lose Cam Johnson and they lose Cam Thomas, or Jordan Fernandez pulls Cam Thomas at the end of the game. They're down by 18 points. Nearing the end of the third quarter, Jordan Fernandez calls a timeout, and they close the game on just an improbable and epic run to grab a 128-120 win over the Warriors, who are the number one team in the Western Conference right now. And it's really just unbelievable. Like, it's at a point right now with the Nets where they were 12.5-point underdogs in this game. That was before they lost Cam Johnson. He sprained his ankle, and before they obviously pulled Cam Thomas in this one. He's been dealing with a back injury, but they just wanted to manage his load. And they come back. Dennis Schroeder plays unbelievable, has 31 points on, I think it was 11 of 18 shooting or something along those lines. He leads the way. But then alongside him, it's Jalen Wilson, it's Zaire Williams, it's Keon Johnson, Trendon Watford, even Tyrese Martin gets in on this, Shake Milton. It's just really been, Jordan Fernandez has talked about this next man up mentality, but it really has been this. And all of that stuff, the next man up, the Brooklyn grit, all the cliches, whatever you want to throw out there, they have become accurate descriptors of this Nets team because they are just winning games and they're performing above expectations on a nightly basis, no matter who's out there. And that really was the case in this game. And we saw the way that the Nets want to play, which is obviously, 3-point heavy, fast, getting those looks up, moving the ball. They've been doing all that. They did it against Sacramento, and they did it against this Golden State Warriors team, and it really was regardless of who was in the game. So it was an unbelievable win, and it brings the Nets to 8-10 on the season. And, temperatures are starting to get a little hot in terms of how people are thinking about the tank. Some people are worried. The Nets are now on a 34-win pace, so I do think that there's reasonable, worries after this point. Like, after winning this Golden State game, I think the Nets are going to regress. Like, they made, I think, 43s almost across this back-to-back in Sacramento and Golden State. So there's some room for regression there. But if you're looking outside of that, this team is playing a brand of basketball in terms of winning the game at the three-point line, defending, and just hustling and buying in on that level where I said on the last podcast, I think they're going to be able to compete a lot of nights. And the three-point shooting will regress. Like, they're dealing with some injuries now. I think they're going to be cautious with injuries. Cam Johnson rolled his ankle. They lost Noah Clowney to an ankle sprain in the Sacramento game. Nick Claxton has a back strain he's dealing with. Cam Thomas has a little bit of a nagging back injury. So those injuries are going to slow them down. I think they're going to be cautious with it. But right now, it's gotten to a point where this Nets team is playing good basketball regardless of who's out there. And I think a lot of that is a testament to the stylistic way that Jordan Fernandez wants to play the system and just the overall mentality in terms of hustle, in terms of grit, in terms of all those cliches and things that you don't tend to think about as, maybe give much credence to in terms of NBA team building. But the Nets have really done that. And, people are worried about the tank. But if you're looking at a positive of this team early on, Jordan Fernandez, man, he looks like a keeper because he's taking guys, down the stretch of this game, like Keon Johnson and Tyrese Martin are playing high-level defense. Trendon Watford is coming in there and finding his spots on the court. He's gotten through to Cam Thomas, it seems like. In these last couple of games in particular, Cam distributing the ball at a pretty high level, and his shot diet in terms of getting away from maybe some of the mid-range, less analytical-friendly looks has really leaned into the three-point shot. I mean, the Nets are fourth in the NBA in true shooting right now, and I think that was, evident and illustrated by these back-to-back wins with them putting up 43s a game. I don't know how many exactly, but it was over 40 in both of these games. They shot at close to 50% in both of these games. Now, they're not going to shoot that well, but they're raising their floor because they put up all those shots. They win that math game against their opponents, and they have veterans like Dennis Schroeder, like Cam Johnson, like these guys who can control the game. They have a younger player in Cam Thomas who has just been a dynamite scorer and is having one of the best seasons of his career. I mean, all these guys, this roster just isn't that bad. Like that's the most basic way that I can say it. Is I think that these guys were slept on entering the season. You look at the starting five, they have these guys. Cam Johnson's performing above expectations. Dennis Schroeder is. Cam Thomas is. They're doing it within the system of the offense. And then you go down the roster, the guys who really contributed down the stretch of this game in Golden State, Jalen Wilson, Zaire Williams, two guys who Zaire was a salary dump. Jalen Wilson was the number 51 pick in the 2023 draft. Those guys giving massive contributions. Keon Johnson coming in the game late, hitting threes and D'ing up. Trendon Watford making buckets down the stretch of that win, that home win a few games ago, had 2 buckets in the final minute, then comes in and does it, has a huge bucket with like 3 minutes left in this game, and then hits a dagger 3. All of that, it's just this roster's deeper. I said it on the last pod. They don't have holes. They have guys who, they don't really have guys who stick out of like, whoa, that guy has no place in NBA rotation. They don't have it right now. And with that, and with them buying into Jordi Fernandez's system, they're playing above expectations. And Sean Marks is going to face a decision soon because, they're at 8-10 right now. The schedule, they could slow down. I said that last week. I thought that they were going to slow down. They haven't done it yet. So Sean Marks is going to get to a point where with each win, the pressure is going to start ramping up on him to make these moves. And he's going to be put in a situation where he might have to sell off these guys maybe earlier than he expects, or they might just ride it out and say, hey, we're going to take this to the trade deadline and then decide then, and wherever the chips fall, they fall. But that tanking conversation, those potential trade conversations, the conversation about Jordi Fernandez, the way this team's playing, the way that they could potentially build this out moving forward beyond this year. I spoke about all of it with Puccio and Helwig, and I hope that you guys really enjoy the talk. Touched on a lot of different subjects, coming off just an improbable victory and really an improbable start to this season. So excited to hear that. Hope you guys enjoy it after a quick break. All right, coming out of the break, I'm joined by Anthony Puccio and Collin Helwig from NetsDaily, also hosts of the Brooklyn Pod. And fellas, crazy game last night. I just recorded an intro getting into some of what we saw. Right off the bat, just want to get your reaction. What are you guys thinking as you're watching that performance unfold last night? And that's coming back from 18 down, playing a roster of, frankly, a lot of guys that a lot of casual NBA fans probably don't even know who they are. So what was your reaction?
It's the Nets are back at probably the wrong time. We saw this back when Kenny Atkinson was head coach. These games where you kind of penciled them out. You saw the injury report, you see the opponent that they're going against, and you kind of just disregard this game. You say it's the second night of a back-to-back. These guys, they're going to put Jalen Wilson out there for 40 minutes. They're going to play Zaire Williams for 35 minutes. And they come back. They have a great head coach in Jordi Fernandez, and they're fighting with the number 1 seed in the West. And like I said, they look like the team that Joe Tsai has said that he's wanted for so long. This competitive, fun team that Brooklyn can get around. That's what I'm watching. It's great to see from my perspective, but I know the people that are on the tank aren't so happy about that.
Yeah, I danced around a bunch of different thoughts. I mean, it was such a late game, and it took me a while to go to bed after, so that should tell you enough about the nature of the game. It was a long time to wind down. I think the fan base was riled up. Those that were anti-tank were up really excited. Those that were pro-tank were just angry all night. But I kept coming back to the thought that this was the team that the Nets were supposed to be last year, both in terms of their draft positioning and in terms of their grittiness. They brought back that quote-unquote Brooklyn grit. I feel like we were going to see that last year. First full year without the stars. That was something that the team, if it was going to be good, would have to rely on, and it wasn't there. And the other half of it is that they didn't control their draft picks at this time last year. So on nights like last night where they beat a team that probably should have beat them, there's no upset side of it where it's like, oh, we're ruining our draft position. It was just win as many games and there's no consequences to it. Now there are consequences to it. So that's why everyone's head is like in a pretzel right now. So for better or worse, I'm going to lean for better because I'm sure we'll get into this later, but nailing the coaching hire is something really important, and it looks that way so far. So I'll say for better right now, but for better or worse, it seems like this is a team we were supposed to get a year late.
Yeah, my takeaway is maybe this is just who the Nets are supposed to be. Like maybe they're just supposed to be like the scrappy underdog team that defies expectations and they'll just live there for the rest of their NBA existence. And like that's all that it'll be. But as you said, Collin, like, early takeaways from this stretch and the way the Nets are playing is it seemed like they just knocked the head coaching hire out of the park with Jordi Fernandez. I mean, they're really playing a style of basketball that we might get into a little bit later that seems like, it could regress because it's very 3-point reliant, but these guys have bought into it in terms of the effort and, stylistically how he wants to play. And the early returns with a roster that I think we all know is, lacking high-end star talent have been very encouraging. But the interesting part about this game, they beat Sacramento as underdogs, missing guys shorthanded. They come back extremely shorthanded, and they beat this Warriors team that's the number one team in the Western Conference right now. And it's almost like we're starting it's like a civil war amongst the Nets fan base somewhat. I think, to less of a degree of what we saw when KD and Kyrie, and there were some of those paths that people were debating back then. But now it's the tank versus the try to compete and all of that. And there's a lot of different opinions of how to feel while the Nets are doing this. Because, Collin, as you said, there's going to be comparisons potentially to that 2018-2019 team, which I think is the most, popular team and fond, team that fans like to look back on in the Brooklyn era. But there were no consequences back then. You could fully root for that team and buy in because they didn't have the draft pick and they were just trying to build up, any positive, surrounding the organization any way they could. Now there's the question of, is this hurting their draft pick to a point where it's going to be detrimental to the team building moving forward? Because you're kind of having to weigh those positives and those negatives. And I think it's still early, and we'll get into whether this tank is actually in jeopardy and how the organization might be viewing this. But you guys putting your Nets fan cap on, because I think you both have been fans of the team growing up. When you're watching these games, what is your rooting? What is your instinct? Because I think some fans might be extremely one way or the other, but some might be kind of conflicted. So I'm curious, how are you guys feeling as you're watching the Nets come back from 18 down in Golden State last night with Tyrese Martin and Keon Johnson out there and they're hitting threes and all that? What is your emotional reaction?
Well, I'll say that I don't think I've quite decided yet. I am everything you just said is I'm torn for those things. One thing I'll say is at the end of the day, sports, the objective is to win. I'll never fault someone who says they're my team, I want to see them win. I feel like that's the core of what everyone does when they put on a team, when they put on to watch their team. That's what they do. So I will never not understand that side of it. But at the same time, I'm like an analytical guy, at least more than some of my other contemporaries. And I just think that I also understand hey, it's you got to stack losses to get yourself in that position. It's very, I feel like it's almost like the emotional side of it is we talk about emotion versus how much are you thinking numbers and stuff. The emotional side of it is go for the win. The numbers side of it, I totally understand. Yeah, tank, lose games. Tank is, maybe I wouldn't say that word because I do think establishing a winning culture is important. But yeah, as I go circles and circles here right now, that's my answer. That is, I don't know that I have one. It's really like flipping a coin. What do you think, Pooch?
I still have to watch and hope that they win. It's just in my DNA. I know this is a generational draft, and they have the opportunity to grab somebody that you hope can pan out to be a superstar and be a franchise leading player. But when you watch a team like this, you see them establishing an identity. You see them actually growing under Jordi Fernandez and buying into what this culture is supposed to be about. Not just now, but going forward. It's so much bigger than this year. I'm looking at something that they're setting a foundation, and the expectations were so low that winning is so much fun. I understand both sides of it, but I'm the same person that came out on our own podcast and said this team is not going to win any more than 18 games, and they've won 8 so far, right? And it is a damn joy watching them buying in and playing hard. I'm so conflicted because at the end of the day, if they lose, I say great. all right, their lottery stock just went up. But if they win, I'm saying, you know what? Good for them. Like Jordy's coaching his ass off. These guys are playing their asses off for him. And this is everything that we've wanted in the Nets team. So it's so conflicting. But I have to say, just like the basketball purist in me, the competitor, I always want to watch these guys win.
Yeah, and what you said, I think it's easy to see the logic behind both sides. And me personally, I understand both sides of it completely. And it's like I've been with this as a New York Giants fan, like watching them, and we've seen the poor side of that, and the bottom outcome of what that can lead to. So there is a real there's a real downside and a negative to potentially playing yourself out of those top picks. The thing I would say was, if I'm talking about that Giants situation, like they're doing that last year down the stretch of the season in these meaningless games, with Cutlets DeVito and all that. But if you're talking about the Nets right now, nobody expect them to be a playoff team, but like there is real value and meaning into a first-time head coach, Jordy Fernandez, taking this job for a Nets team that has just had an epic carousel of coaches since they moved to Brooklyn. I mean, I think they've made 10 coaching changes in the, 12 or 13 years since they came to Brooklyn. So they have not had that guy. So there is real value. Like, it's anybody saying that, like, I see some of the reactions, and it's like some people winning these games, it's like the sky is falling, the world is melting down, like all this stuff. And I understand like the passion and the fear behind missing out on the top draft pick, but I think it would be you'd be hard pressed not to find the real positives about, what this team is doing right now. Now, you see the negatives also, and that is very real because the NBA, I think you'd say that, basketball is probably the most individualistic sport there is in terms of having, a star and that high-end talent that could carry you. Obviously, like in the NFL and football, you have the quarterback who's extremely important. Baseball, you can have that pitcher, but even less so there. But basketball, it really does all center around that one centerpiece guy. So, and you could argue, if you're the Nets, that you could get that guy through the tank. And if you keep winning and doing all this stuff, you can get that guy potentially by attracting marquee high-end talent who buys into what you're trying to do here. And that's something that I want to touch on a little bit as this gets going. But where the Nets are now, they're 8-10. As Puccio said, the win projection entering the season was 18.5. They're, if stuff stays as is, they're on a pace to crushing that. They're at a 34 win pace right now or something like that. The expectation around the league is that the Nets would continue a roster tear down in the season, trade off those veterans like Cam Johnson, Dennis Schroeder, Dorian Finney-Smith, all of which have played extremely well this season. And I think the questions are going to start creeping in now. 8-10, they're 2.5 games out of the 4 seed. Team's looking a little spunky. Does Sean Marks start sipping the Kool-Aid and, drinking this? And does it potentially get to a place where, hey, we're going to lean into this. We're going to try to compete. I don't want to give up Cam Johnson. I don't want to give up these guys. I've had my opinion on this. I've talked about it on recent podcasts, but want to get your guys' take. Do you think that there's a scenario, and do you believe that there's a situation where they could actually lean into this and they could go in the other direction as opposed to just tearing it down and going into this tank?
We talked about this on our show for a little bit, so I think he can lean that way, but lean, not swerve like aggressively. So I think Zaire Williams maybe isn't the best example, but it's the one I'm going to use right now. He's a guy who has come to the Nets and has contributed to winning, but he also hits the mark of where he's kind of like on the Nets timeline. I don't know how old he is, but he hasn't been in the league too long.
23.
Gotcha. That's even younger than I thought he was, honestly. So if he can find guys that are, like the Grizzlies were done with him, they were willing to just offload him. So when you say like or a buyer, I'm not thinking like, oh, we need to, like in baseball, like, oh, we need to sign like a huge like home run hitter and like a starter. But I could see them being buyers in terms where they look for guys that fit in that like Zaire Williams gray area where, yeah, you can come in and you're going to play, and maybe I'll toss out, I'll drop 2 of our 22nd round picks in the next 7 years or however many it is, and be buyers in that sense where I go get a player. The trade for the Rockets pick, and, I don't think I believe Mikal Bridges was the Nets' best player last year, but that's the narrative. And when you trade your, quote, best player, it's just that wasn't a lean into a rebuild. That was a stiff swerve into a rebuild. So I don't think he's going to swerve really hard one way and then swerve really hard the other way 8 or 7 months later.
It's a difficult decision to make, and I think that it's so important to look back at Sean Marks' comments at media day, at his preseason conference, where he says tanking is not in our vocabulary, and flexibility is, right. And these options that the Nets have are good options. These are things that you hope to have. You hope that, you know what, come December, late December, early January, you kind of have an idea of what direction this team is going in, right? We still have 64 games left. It's exciting to talk about how good they've been so far, but we are still in the early stages of the season. They have another month or two to evaluate. And the fact that they have options at this stage of the season where they can say, you know what, let's sell off these veterans and get young guys in here, get draft picks in here, and really embrace the tank is a great option. Option number two, if it's, you know what, let's keep these guys, and in fact, let's build on this, make the playoffs, and take advantage of a bad Eastern Conference while we can. That's also not a bad option either, while they just hired a good head coach that the players really like. So I don't know if they are really going to pick a direction right now. I think that they're probably thrilled that they have options, flexibility, they have cap space after the season, and they have a ton of draft picks one way or another. And spin it how you want, but they have 4 first-round draft picks next year. Maybe they could combine those and still trade up if they are a winning team and their pick isn't that good.
Yeah, it's you talk about Sean Marks' comments, and he's made a lot of comments that are significant. That he had comments about the tank recently. I think one of the reporters, I think it was from NewJersey.com or something, talked to him about it before one of the Knicks games, and he said, like you said, tanking isn't our vocabulary. He said that at media day, all that stuff, but the next time a GM admits to tanking will be the first time. So that's not anything I read too much into. He did say before, after he made the Mikal Bridges trade over the summer, that the strength of the 2025 and 2026 draft classes played a role in that decision. So he is obviously cognizant of the talent there, the path. These GMs, Sean Marks is not a dumb guy. He realizes the importance of landing a guy like that. The question is just, how do you get to that guy? Is it through the draft? Is it potentially the trade route, something that they did before, something we're going to touch on recently? I do think it's kind of funny to just think about like Sean Marks and Joe Tsai sitting up there watching these games. Like, I'm sure they're obviously happy. Like Sean, undoubtedly it benefits him because people are like, "Whoa, this guy picked a great head coach. He brought in guys like Zaire Williams and drafted guys like Jalen Wilson and found all this talent." But at the same time, it's like they did, as you said, Collin, they swerved and picked a direction seemingly this summer. And it's like when Sean was trying to win and they were trying to do all this stuff, it seems like everything went wrong. And now they potentially are going to tank and lose. And Keon Johnson's banging corner threes as they're trying to come back against the Golden State Warriors. So I do think that that's really interesting. And I think that just thinking about how their reactions are and how they're perceiving this is really funny. But, getting into that place where they can potentially have a top pick, I think is the ultimate goal. And I think some of their actions, illustrated it. Like you look at the game last night and it's kind of weird. They're making this comeback. Cam Thomas had an unbelievable game in Sacramento and he was playing really well at 23 points in 23 minutes. And, Jordi Fernandez pulls him down the stretch of that game. And I thought, he has a back injury that he's tending to that, he must have strained his back. He must be hurt and all this. And then Jordi was asked about it post game and he kind of like tap danced around it. He didn't say it was an injury thing. He said that Cam had some turnovers and he looked tired and that he was protecting him from himself. So it didn't sound like it was like an injury thing. It sounded like, oh man, like we're coming back here. Might not be the worst thing in the world to let Cam Thomas sit for the rest of this game. So that's how, and not a tanking team, but a team that doesn't have a ton of urgency potentially to give all of their resources to win these games. That's how they could be operating. And I think that they're going to continue to be cautious with injuries as this season progresses because there's no reason to risk anything, especially given the win-loss incentive. And then, when I asked you guys about leaning into, winning versus, leaning into the tank, to me, they don't even have to be buyers for it to constitute, leaning into the other direction, because them not trading these guys like Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, Dennis Schroeder, like holding on to those guys past the trade deadline to me would constitute leaning into this winning situation and trying to go for it, because Otherwise, they could bring those guys back, but Cam's 28, Dennis and Dorian, it's a different conversation. They're 30 going on 31. Unless you're, if you're not trading those guys, you're going for something, because there's no reason not to trade them in that scenario, because they have, at least they're expiring contracts. They have at least some value. So it would make sense, to cash in and capitalize on those guys' value, particularly Cam Johnson, who they don't have to trade now, but he's playing so well that might be able to get them a mini haul, which is something that maybe you didn't envision entering the season. But next thing I want to talk about is we have these two paths. We all agree that landing the marquee guy is the most important thing in the NBA. Now, the Nets' tanking direction can do that through the draft. You could make an argument that if you keep winning, that guys might see this, as they did with that 2018-2019 team, what Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant saw, and say they have a really good head coach here. They have some young pieces. They have a surrounding core. They have cap space this offseason. This could be a situation where maybe a star wants to come here. A guy that's been linked to the Nets is obviously Giannis Antetokounmpo with the Milwaukee Bucks. They're starting to right the ship a little bit, but still a lot of uncertainty there. When you guys are evaluating those two paths, does one stick out to you as more practical than the other?
I think the draft one does, just to be blunt about it, in terms of the new CBA and signing guys. This is going to sound like a hot take, but I do stand behind it. Giannis doesn't excite me too much, just in terms of his age and a guy who relies on his athleticism. He's better than Dwight Howard ever was, but that fall off to this day has been something that's amazed me. So I don't know that I would trade the Nets situation right now for the Milwaukee Bucks situation right now. Like, if they give up their picks and a lot of guys to get Giannis Antetokounmpo, how good is that team? And then I bet you the Bucks, they want to keep their guy. He's the best player since Kareem, but the Bucks, I'm sure, would convince themselves, they just won a bunch of games, but before, when it was not looking good for them, hey, we got all these draft picks now that we didn't have before. Like, there's levels to it, but Giannis is a name that scares me. I do think also, maybe just from a Nets fan perspective, you'll never be able to get past the Boston Celtics trade that landed them Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. I don't know that the Nets have had a hard enough time curating a fan base in a city that the New York Knicks have been in for however many years to begin with. I really don't think it would sit well if they did this again and sold. You have a chance to do something in Brooklyn that they've never had the chance to right now. So I'm leading draft, but it's a case-by-case thing. I think Giannis being available is different than Luka Doncic being available. Now, Luka's not been mentioned in trade rumors, but that's, it's just to give you an example in terms of case-by-case.
Is the latter an option? Can they build through the draft but also add a star at some point?
That's an interesting question. It's actually something that I talked about with Brian Scalabrine. Asked me about that on Sirius NBA Radio, and he said when the Giannis rumors were really starting to circle, he said, if you could do that trade while keeping your top draft pick, would you want to do that? I mean, I don't think that I think that pick would most likely want to be included if you were making the deal. Now, it depends on when this deal is happening, obviously, but I do think it's an interesting thing of saying, if you're thinking about a team building perspective, you have to trade all those picks for, that star potentially. Like, all the picks you got in the Knicks, all that stuff, you got to trade that. But then if you're looking at this top pick that they're going to have, say, if they do figure it out and they start to tank and they land that pick really high, what is that worth in terms of value? That guy as a foundational building block. What is his on-court value? If you flip that asset, how much is that worth? So there are interesting conversations and discussions going along with that. But I do think it's interesting, like in the Giannis scenario, I think it's interesting because people who might be excited by it might think, oh, like, you get Giannis, you add him onto this team. Look at how well they're playing. You build around that. That could be a good team. But then people don't account for the fact that it's not just going to be picks going out in that trade. It's going to be Cam Johnson, or another big salary. It's going to be, Noah Clowney, Cam Thomas, like these young players that you like. You're trading for a guy like Giannis, who's a top 3 player in the league. Give us all the picks, and any young player that you have that you're excited by, give them to us. Like, that's the baseline of what these deals usually are. So like Collin said, like, in my opinion, I think that it's not an option that's like shut out, but I do think that the new CBA, the trade restrictions that they put on, these first and second apron teams, the way that they're incentivizing teams to build. Like the Nets had an advantage in the past with Joe Tsai. We saw it during the Big Three era. They could just spend up into the luxury tax year after year after year and really just go all in on this. The new CBA was, designed to prevent stuff like that and to level the playing field. I mean, to get these owners like the Steve Ballmers and the Joe Tsais and the whoever in these big markets to not have such a big advantage over these smaller teams. So in my opinion, I think that the draft option is much more palatable. And Collin, I think you made an outstanding point of, I talked about this I also talked about this on Sirius. The Nets, when was the last time the Nets drafted a guy that people could really, really get excited about as like that homegrown guy? I guess it was Derek Favors in 2010. Like that didn't work out. You go back.
Richard Jefferson.
Yeah, like you go back before that. We're talking about Richard Jefferson, Kenyon Martin, guys who I think were really good players, but nobody would consider them like superstars. Like Jason Kidd was the star on that team. So it's been so long since they've done this. So I understand why there's the passionate response among fans who are saying, they're blowing this, they're ruining the tank and all that. And, they're going to miss out on this guy. Like, I understand that. I understand the people who are excited about the winning and all that. And, I think a natural pivot and something that we can talk about now is how you guys feel about where they're at in terms of, they're 8-10 through 18 games, what the potential moves could be going from here. Like after this win, if you guys are somebody who's in on the tank after that Golden State win last night, like what's your temperature at? Are you actually worried about the pace that they're on and the direction that this thing is heading, in regard to the tank? Or is it something where you think it's early and they'll be able to course correct this?
I feel like it's an unwritten thing that you don't really gauge who the good teams are in the NBA until Christmas or around that time. So I think it's okay to flip that and say, like, we're not just like teams evaluate themselves and just say, like, how good are we until then? You can wait until that point. I think the best thing about the Nets right now is that we're able to kind of enjoy both sides of it to a certain degree. You can enjoy watching competitive basketball, but there's plenty of track out in head where if you want to lose, you can still do that. I will say, though, Eric, when you're going to cover Ace Bailey and I see the highlights from Cooper Flag on my phone, then I get maybe just like a little bit like, damn, what I mean? So
a little bit. You see Cooper Flag, playing D like Anthony Davis out there and hitting like crossover jumpers. You're like, maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing to lose a few of these games.
Yeah, those guys are different. They move different than everyone else on the college floor right now. So there's two sides of every like Nets argument now that you can kind of understand both sides of it. But for now, I guess I'm not worried. I'm going to give it a couple more weeks.
How about you, Pooch?
I'm watching a game like that and I'm saying this is a good basketball team. This is a good team. They're beating good teams. They're the only team in the Eastern Conference with 5 wins against the West. Like, it's not like they're out here beating bad teams. They're beating good basketball teams. There's a couple cases that I have to make, and that's one. They're beating some good teams. Number 2, the East is wide open. They're 2.5 games back from the 4 seed. And number 3, a conversation that I had with Joe Dumars, the VP of the NBA over there, is that when they instilled the play-in game, it was quite literally to avoid tanking. So the way that we're so accustomed to thinking about the playoffs as an 8-seed race, we're looking at now 10. And the Nets aren't just in that play-in area, despite being 2 games below 500. Like they're really in that actual top 6, top 7, top 8 area where, again, if they were beating on bad teams and the East was really, really tough, I would say this is a tough road ahead, but they are actually beating good teams. They've given me no reason to say like this is the stretch where they're gonna let it go. Right now, obviously this can change if Sean Marks decides he gets an offer that he can't refuse and he just sells everybody off and everything can just swerve off. All it takes is one Shams bomb, I guess now. I can't say Woj bomb, but one Shams bomb and that's it. But the way that I'm watching it and the way that I'm seeing this team play and buy in, I have no reason to believe that they're just going to slow down anytime soon. Again, look at the guys who they won with against the West Best last night.
Yeah, and that last line would probably concern a lot of Nets fans. And I agree with you. Like you say, a stretch where they're going to let go of the rope and you think that all this is going to change. I was doing like think it was before that Boston game in Boston that they lost in overtime. And everybody was starting to get worried about the tank and all this. And I said on my pod, and maybe I'm an idiot, I don't know. I said, guys, look, you look at the upcoming stretch. They got Boston twice. They got Cleveland. They got the Knicks twice. They're going to go on this West Coast trip. Like, this should probably course correct itself pretty soon. And like, I think this could look a lot different down the stretch. And then you're looking at that. They lose in overtime to Boston. They almost beat the Cavaliers and give them their first loss. They do beat New Orleans. And then, they go on this West Coast trip. They almost beat the Knicks, come back from 20 down in that game. While playing without a center, I might add. And then they go on this West Coast trip and they beat Sacramento and they beat Golden State. So it's like, I do think that it's going to regress and come back to the mean, but maybe I just need to, buy into this and stop like resisting it. Cause I don't know. It's like, if you're a gambling man out there, if you just bought into this Nets thing after the first couple games, you'd be rolling in the dough right now. I think they're like 12-5 against the spread this season, which is, just gives you an indication of how much, they're being slept on and undervalued by these people. Like, those people are supposed to be more on it than anyone else, the odds makers. And they've been just wrong about this team time and time again. And, if we're let's talk a little actual basketball about what's happening on the court there. And, they are playing a style of basketball that I think is going to regress somewhat. Like, I think the biggest factor behind this success has been the 3-point line and the style that Jordi Fernandez has tried to play offensively, because the Nets aren't a good defensive team. Like, they're okay. I'd say average, slightly below average, but I think they're like 8th in offensive rating right now, and doing that without a star on this team. And it's because they are consistently winning the math game of the 3-point line. Like, they are getting threes up and they have a lot of shooters, so they're making a lot. I think I put a stat out yesterday, but they're averaging like an 8-point advantage at the 3-point line this season. They're making like 2.7 more threes per game than their opponents, and they're shooting like 40 per game while holding their opponents to like 33 per game. And they have a lot of guys who can shoot. So, you look at the way they're playing, you look at the defensive versatility that they do have, the guys that they've been able to bring in on the back end, whether it be a Zaire Williams, a Jalen Wilson, a Keon Johnson, to complement the guys they had here. They're playing a brand of basketball that I think their shooting is going to regress. Like, they made like almost 43s over this back-to-back, which I don't think is sustainable, but there is reason to believe that they could continue to play at a decently high level, maybe regress a little bit, but win just enough to be in like that play-in conversation or whatever. When you guys are evaluating the way that this season has played out on the court, what has been the most surprising aspect to you of this Nets team?
It's a good question because there's a bunch. I guess, we heard a lot of praise about Jordi coming in and everything was positive and like glowing. But one of the things I kept saying was he's not. I remember saying it. Because I covered when he was coaching Canada and the Olympics, and I broke down a lot of those games. And I remember saying no one is going to declare him this great Nets coach because of how he's coaching Team Canada right now. That was kind of like at the core of like every point I like would write about or try to make. And then on the Brooklyn, Puccio and I talked about it, and we expected that they were going to lose more games, just like everyone. We expected them to lose more games than they have already, and that people wouldn't be able to be stamp the Jordi hire. And it is still premature, 18 games in, but nonetheless, to stamp the Jordi hire as give it the green check mark, say it's a success. So I guess that I'm just so surprised that not so surprised, but it's crazy how able he's been able to win us over. Now, on a night like last night, I tweeted it was like back-to-back, literally don't have a center. Your two best players, one gets hurt, the other one sort of gets hurt, and you beat the best team in the West. You can't draw up a better recipe for, wow, this guy's a good coach, and to come up with like that kind of a take. So I'm just maybe not surprised, but so impressed by him. I'm not as versed in the game as my colleague Lucas Kaplan or even you, Eric, in terms of breaking down what's this screen and, all the strict X's and O's. I'm learning, I'm getting there, but not there yet. But I can tell that what he does now, inbound plays, the screens, the pin downs, it's so much more advanced than what we saw with Jacques Vaughn. So I hesitant to say surprised because we did hear a lot of he was highly touted, but very, very impressed with Jordi and how fast he's been able to make those changes and make the team look different.
Pooch?
Yeah, I mean, I think Collin makes a lot of good points. I think how fast they're playing, we kind of we expected that. You always hear teams say before the season that they want to play fast, but these guys are getting up the court when they make a defensive stop. I think they are one of the slowest paced teams in the NBA.
Yeah,
but they're getting
full court pace. They're slow, but they get up a lot of shots. Like they're playing faster of late.
Right. They get that ball across the half court line very fast, and they get into their sets. Their off ball movement is fantastic. But what I've really, really appreciated about this team and Jordy's coaching is his adaptability to situations. Watching those two Knicks games, they were full court pressing Jalen Brunson and fronting him from the second that ball tipped off until that game ended. Both games. Like, he wants to make those guys and make these stars work. And you don't really see many teams do that. You don't see teams full court press. You don't see them pushing guys up right from the start, right? There was another example in the Nuggets game. They were up by 3 late in the game, and Jordy was only putting one guy man on man against Jokic, letting him isolate, letting him do his thing, just so long as it didn't lead to a 3.
Mm-hmm.
Every time they were up by 3, he stayed with that one-on-one. Then suddenly, when it was circumstantial that they can kind of show a double or shade or shadow, he would do it. Like, his ability to just adjust on the fly and change their game plan, change their defensive styles. It's like he's like a football coach out there. He's pulling audibles in the middle of right in the middle of the shift. So, to see how connected that they are, not just playing fast, not just these off-ball screens, but the adaptability to situations and who they're playing against, understanding. It's very clear that these guys are prepared night in and night out.
Yeah, and I think that was evident last night. I mean, you look at the way that they defended down the stretch. Like, they won the fourth quarter 41-28, and giving up 28 points in the fourth quarter. It's not great, but you look at the way they guarded down the stretch of that game. You got guys like Keon Johnson and Tyrese Martin just D'ing up, working over screens, communicating through switches, doing all those things. Then you look at the way they play offensively, and I talked about them winning the math game at the 3-point line. They're playing consistently no matter who's in the lineup. Like, that stylistic way that they want to play, it doesn't change. Like, it doesn't even change when you put Ben Simmons in there, who doesn't want to look at the basket. If there was $1 million on top of the rim, he doesn't want to look at the basket. It still doesn't. I mean, he leads to a lot of threes and does all that stuff. But like, they played him and Nick Claxton together at the beginning of that Sacramento game. I've been extremely anti Simmons Claxton pairing, and I stand by that take, right now. But it didn't look bad for that small stretch that they played right then. And I think the things that he's trying to instill, they're buying into. Like, Pooch, you talk about the defensive pressure and the full court pressure. I was listening to the Warriors post game late last night and early this morning, and Moses Moody is talking about it, and he said, they play hard. Like, they were pressuring, they were applying that full court, even down 20. It didn't waver. So, like, they put the pressure on us, and they did a good job of playing hard. And you talk about that relating to culture and the way that other teams perceive you. And I know the importance of culture on any kind of sports team. I think the word in the pros is a little bit overused nowadays, but like, that stuff, when you're a guy like a young player like Moses Moody or these other teams that they're playing around the league, that stuff doesn't go unnoticed. Like, wow, that team plays hard. They have a guy in Jordy Fernandez who's getting through to them. Like, it can't be a negative. Like, it's just a positive for them to be going and playing against these teams, whether they have stars, whether they have young guys who could be down the line looking to have a change of scenery, to know, like, wow, that coach has his stuff together. He has them playing hard. And I just think that, that's a resounding positive from the start of the season. And I don't think you could look at it any other way than that. And honestly, like, it's just been kind of shocking, man. Like, there's no other way to say it. Like, the way that this season has unfolded to start, I think people thought that they could perform above expectations somewhat. Like, I thought 18.5 was very low. I think that number was set there because people think they're going to trade off guys as the season progresses, and they still might. But I mean, these guys are playing good basketball. Like, Dennis Schroeder, Cam Johnson, as veterans, are just doing, such great things on a nightly basis. Cam Thomas. If you want to talk about Jordy Fernandez and getting through to somebody, the way that Cam Thomas is playing, I think a very big positive, because Jordy said he wanted Cam to be efficient. He wanted him, obviously, to reevaluate some of his mindset and the way that he looked at the offensive end of the floor. And he's been doing that. Let's talk about Cam quickly, because I think that he played unbelievable in these 2 games before he got pulled against Golden State. Just, how have you guys felt about the way that he's played and the way that he seems to be buying into Jordy Fernandez's coaching and his vision?
Yeah, I know Jordy oftentimes talks about not just Cam's assists, but his potential assists.
Yep.
And listening to him do that and watching him play, it's hard not to notice that as well. And the Nets go ballistic at times from three, and sometimes they don't though. And he's making really good reads. He still has his every now and then, like he'll sprinkle in like a hero ball like possession, but guy like that, I don't have a problem with it. I think he's I'm always impressed as a basketball fan as someone who is able to do the things that I don't think are teachable. Now, like being able to like Brook Lopez, he kind of taught himself how to be a 3-point shooter, setting screens, boxing out, those things are kind of teachable. Being a guy where you have to draw on the defense and you're sensing how close is the pressure and how is it there where do I have just enough pressure to get a high percentage shot off? Or is it just coming in enough where, all right, now it's time for me to make that pass? And I think he's done such a good job at making those reads. And I think it's something that, maybe Jordy has gotten in his head and like told him something to do, but to me, it feels more like a feel thing and something that comes with time. So I've just been very impressed with how he's been able to do that and just really like sense the defense. It's almost like a quarterback, like in a collapsing pocket, like his pocket presence is very impressive to me.
Yeah, Collin makes some great points. He's making the right reads. You could see from the beginning of the season, the first couple of games, if you watched him, he was a little bit flustered with those double teams. And you've seen how he's grown from there, how he's learned how to kind of keep it under control, make the right read, make the right pass. Now, he's averaging career highs in points and his field goal percentage and in assists, but he's also averaging career high in turnovers too. So there is still a learning curve. He's not fully there yet, but he is making the right reads, as Collin said, as these teams continue to show double and sometimes even triple teams. I'd be ignorant to say that Cam Thomas is not cognizant that he's on a contract year. They didn't extend him. So I think that he's doing all the right things. He's buying into Jordy's system. He often credits him in his post-game comments. And that's an ode to him as well, his growth, that he's speaking well. He's speaking like a leader. He's being, more mature per se, for lack of a better phrase. I think that Cam Thomas himself deserves a lot of credit. I think Jordy Fernandez, for getting through to him, deserves a lot of credit. But we'd be fooling ourselves if we didn't realize that a lot of this is also while he's on a contract year and is trying to prove himself, while both sides couldn't come to an agreement. For him, it was a prove it year, and for them, it was also a prove it to us year. So
yeah,
it's
definitely
great to see Jordy get through to him, but also I think that he has that chip on his shoulder that yes, I have to buy.
Absolutely, yeah. I think this recent back-to-back was probably the most encouraging thing I've seen from Cam this season, because we're talking about the passing, which is always a hot, topic. I wrote about it earlier in the year, I think like 10 games in, and Lucas Kaplan wrote about it recently about, Cam's potential assist numbers. And as you said, Collin, something that Jordy harps on a lot, in terms of potential assists for like the first 10 to 15 games of the season, like he was still really far down there, like amongst the highest usage guards in the league. He was ranking towards the bottom in terms of potential assists per touch, and where he was at with that. And I do think that he has, been showing some more willingness in spots, but then he has that game where he has 7 turnovers, I think it was, against Philadelphia, and they lose. And that's a big reason why. And he admitted it after the game. And then he bounced back against Sacramento, and he has 6 assists to 1 turnover in the first quarter of this Golden State game. He only had 1 assist, but the potential assist numbers were definitely up. I didn't check exactly what it was, but the willingness to adjust, where he was really forcing it in a lot of situations against that Philadelphia game. And I'm sure that they went back and watched the tape and you saw that stuff, and the willingness and the feel, as you said, Collin, to see, these situations against Sacramento and Golden State where these doubles are coming and he's making those willing passes. And even not when it's doubles sometimes just when he's driving in and he's feeling the defense collapsing on him, and he's able to make these, whip passes to the corner or, kick it up to like the high quad. And he's doing all those things. And another really, exciting thing for me is just the shot profile, because Cam, the mid-range, he loved the mid-range earlier in his career. Like he ranked towards the top of the league in guards in terms of mid-range frequency. And this year, it's been a lot more threes and a lot more getting to the rim. And his 3-point rate's up. He's shooting it well from 3. Puccio talked about his efficiency. He's he's at around like 60% true shooting, which is a career high. It's above league average, despite the fact that he's taking like 18, 19 shots per game. And that shot profile that Cam is really buying into under Jordi Fernandez is also just indicative of the whole team, because the Nets are like fourth in the NBA in true shooting right now. And that is a big, that's a big indicator of teams that are successful, throughout the last 2 decades of basketball, is true shooting percentage. And a lot of that is the fact that they're shooting well from three, but it's also the style and the buy-in and the way that Jordi Fernandez wants them to play, of getting to the rim, taking high frequency threes, getting away from all that mid-range stuff. So Cam is a microcosm of that. And I think that it's very encouraging the way that that's played out through the entire team. Getting to the end here, don't want to keep you guys around too long. Parting thoughts, the Nets fan base is getting somewhat split right now over some of this direction. And it seems like some people are nervous. Some people are buying into it. As we said earlier, parting thoughts, anything you guys want to leave Nets fans with?
I'll say this, because I remember having this conversation with, so I got some Celtics friends in the family. And so for years when they had, like, Tatum and Brown were younger, they were going in the playoffs, they were competing, but they had still so much out in front of them. Those guys were young. They still had future draft picks. There's two different types of teams that when they're winning that you can root for. There's ones where it's pressure and it's like, we have to win now. And the Nets were that team from 2021 to whatever, the half of 2022 or whatever year, whenever they sold Katie and Kyrie. The level of stress in watching the Nets, whether you care about the tank or whether you want them to be good, is not there anymore, because between the picks and the young players around them, whatever it is that they're going to be, it's all out in front of them right now. And really nothing that happens right now in November of 2024 is going to alter whatever this team becomes, whether it's getting a star or being in the draft. Like I said, they still have room to, quote, tank if that's what they choose to do. So just enjoy the fact that you can watch a team where you don't feel like you have to live and die by every shot. You don't have to live and die by every win. It's not the end of the world if the Nets go out and lose to, I don't know, the Pacers, like they would do from time to time when they had that year, Harden's last year, when they were going on a free fall and stuff like that. And it was, we got to do it now. We got to do it now. We're running out of time. We don't have any picks. The Nets have time. They have picks. They're winning games. Just try to enjoy it for what it is.
I'm going to get a little philosophical with you here, but
Okay.
there's a famous quote, right? Whatever we have the utmost confidence in becomes our own self-fulfilling prophecy. And my advice would be, do not have ultimate confidence in either side, whether it be the tank, whether it be winning. Just enjoy the ride, enjoy what you have in front of you for the first time. And I don't even know how long. You have your own draft picks. You have a fun, competitive team. Whatever it is, there's 64 games left. Sit back on your couch, sit back at Barclays Center, whatever it might be, and just enjoy the ride, because whatever it is, it's headed somewhere better than where we've been the past couple of years. And I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah, Pooch, I think people probably think that that's some philosopher or something who came up with that, but you just came up with that, right, on the spot. Like, that's just an Anthony Puccio original right there, I think, right?
A little young Socrates in me. I had to come on the show and dish some.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Pooch. I think, there's urgency from some people, but there's a lot of positives that can be taken right now. And regardless, I think that the Nets are in a better situation right now from a team building perspective, from the coach, the assets, all the things that they have. They're in a better spot right now. I don't think it's even questionable than where they were at last year. So that's a positive. How much farther they can go in that positive direction, there can be debate about that, but enjoy it. As Collin said, appreciate the fact that they have options going forward and they can do all this stuff. And, it is fun basketball right now. So, don't be so pessimistic if you can. Like, things will unfold. As a Nets fan, it's tough to say they'll unfold as they should, but they're in a good position right now. So that does it. Appreciate you guys for coming on the show. Tell everybody where they can find your work. Obviously, you guys are doing great stuff with your own podcast that you started this season.
Yeah, no, thanks for having us on, Eric. You can find us at I'm Collin Helwig, 2 L's in Collin, 1 L in Helwig on Twitter. And then, Pooch and I do the Brooklyn Pod every Tuesday or Thursday, every 2 weeks. Find it at the Brooklyn Pod, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. We are on YouTube now, Spotify, Apple Music. It's spelled how it sounds, so should be fine. Should be able to find it easy.
All right. Sounds good, guys. Hopefully we can do this again sometimes in the near future, and I'm sure I'll see you around Barclays sometime.
That's right. Yeah.
Thanks for having us, Eric. Appreciate it.
That does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. I'm Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. As I said at the top, if you guys don't already, go subscribe to Believe in Nets wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, go to YouTube. If you guys enjoyed this video, like it, leave a comment. If you do not already, go subscribe. Really appreciate anything that you guys can do. You can find all my work on Twitter. Go to Erik Slater _ for my handle. All my articles from ClutchPoints.com, live game tweets, quotes, news, analysis, all of that you can find there. But the Nets aren't slowing down. You know, we touched on it obviously at length with Puccio and with Collin, but this team is performing above expectations, and there's no reason to believe, maybe outside of the injuries, but if these guys get healthy, there's no reason to believe with Jordi Fernandez and with what these guys have bought into that it's going to change right now. So we'll see. I mean, I'm done trying to project anything about, you know, how this team's going to go in these coming games because they just continue to prove everybody wrong. So just going to enjoy it, going to cover it on Clutch Points, on Twitter, and most importantly here at Believe in Nets. I'll have all that soon. Nets are going to Phoenix on Wednesday. Then they have back-to-back home matchups against the Orlando Magic, 2 in a row on Friday and Sunday. So have all the coverage of that and more here. Talk to you guys soon.